Today we start a series of sermons, and the children's sermons are going to be games to go with this, but this is 6 weeks of sermons that are going to hang together, and it's no problem if you miss one of them or 5 of them, but if you're here for all 6, I think you're going to find some way that these stories relate, and hopefully the messages relate and build on each other. I like preaching sermons. Selfishly, it's a little bit easier on my preparation. I have a little bit of a gluttonous streak. Some of you are gluttons for sugar or hooch or whatever it might be. I like just sitting in front of a keyboard with just a bunch of caffeine just until my abs hurt from leaning over. Like 12, 15 hours. I love it. I love it. Some of you like to run. I don't understand that at all. Another reason I like to do these series is that it keeps me from throwing kind of everything at you at once. You've all been on trips, and you've all taken that bag for your trip, and no matter how long the trip is, no matter how big the trip is, you fill it to the brim until it's hard to get that zipper closed. And a lot of preachers I know, got 20 minutes, they're going to fill it to the brim. Well, I think if we can just do a series and focus on how one thing fits into the larger picture of God's grace, well, maybe that's going to be a better thing for us to do together. Whether you've heard this message 100 times and it's just a refresher, or whether it's a new thing you've never heard about God's grace, let's focus in on one thing and how that ties in to a larger picture of God. A third reason I like to do sermon series, and a third reason I like to sit and listen to series of sermons, is I think it improves all of our creativity together. Hopefully you're going to make different connections between these stories that you might not have if we weren't going to tie them together. Hopefully I can find ways to relate them a little bit differently because we're going to follow one on top of the other. But the thing about that, if we're going to be creative, the thing about that is I only have a limited source of creativity. So I want to ask your help in general. This is a long-term project. Help me out with ideas. If there's something in your heart about the Bible or about faith or about religion or about world religions or whatever it might be, if there's something that just bugs you or excites you and you want to know more about it and use that in worship, send me an email. Worship is supposed to be teamwork, and I promise you that every single person in this room, no matter how young or how old, every one of you has an idea about faith that I don't have. And so I want your ideas. Share those with me. We'll put them together. We'll have some great worship. So today, we start this series, and it's based on the lectionary. A bunch of smart people got together, brought us a series of Bible passages for worship, and it just so happens that this year we have 6 more stories from the Gospel of Luke between now and Advent, when we start paying attention to getting ready for Christmas. So today, millions of people all over the world, in all kinds of churches, will follow Jesus as Luke tells about Jesus moving from his homeland up in the north, up in the rural part of Israel, moving down to the south part of Israel to the urban Jerusalem. This is the height of his popularity. Everyone knows him. This is going to be his last trip for Passover, his last chance to teach us something and to show us something about God. And when I read these 6 passages together, the first time I read them, frankly, I didn't see anything other than chronology that held them together. You all have headings in your Bibles. A lot of you have. Just go ahead and look it up. Luke 17, verse 11. If you're looking at one of these red pew Bibles, there's no heading in here. And so it's really easy to just scan through this story. I read all 6 of them, and it looks just like any gospel writer could have done this. The stories just sounded like Jesus. There was nothing to tip me off to what those stories were about. And in fact, that's the case, that the Bible wasn't written with headings. Originally, the New Testament, written in Greek, actually didn't have originally spaces between the words. Just a whole string of letters, which is, imagine how hard that is to read. The Old Testament in Hebrew didn't even have vowels. So just imagine how hard that was to read. So even before you get to the difficulty of interpretation, just getting our English letters onto the page is really quite a task of interpretation. And then to add the headings for the themes and where the paragraphs break and when sentences start and end, that's a big chore. So some of your Bibles don't have headings to help that, even ye headings of the King James Bible. Some of them are just blank of that. And others, check this one out. This one here, this is my study Bible I like. And there's a bold line here, right in the middle of the chapter. Can't possibly see it way back there. You can barely see it without lights right in front. But right in the middle of chapter 17, it says responses to the kingdom along the way. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Why would there be a heading right in the middle of a chapter? Turns out Luke thinks that he has convinced us in the first 17 and a half chapters, he's convinced us who Jesus is and what Jesus' message is about. And so Luke has decided that at this point in this story that Dennis just read, at this verse, that we are going to twist this and say, what's our response to all that we've heard before? This is like a dividing point for Luke. And the story sounds so similar to other Gospels, but when you pay attention to the fact that a lot of these stories, including this one that Dennis just read, don't show up in any other Gospels. And the ones that do show up over these next 6 weeks, Luke changes them. He adds a little bit of different conversation, or minimizes a character over here, or emphasizes some detail over there. He's telling us something in here, that it is our turn to respond to Jesus. He's told us what God means, what God's grace is, and now it's our turn. Luke seems content with the message, the beginning being there. The last series we did, the beginning, and now we're going to turn to what is the response. And that's the 6 weeks, all about that. So, this story, Dennis just read it. Let's review it. This is just like the children's sermon. You have to raise your hand. Someone raise your hand and tell me what are the salient points of the story we just read. What happened? Healing. Healing is right. Okay, that's one of them. What else? Praising. That's right. The guy came back and praised. What else? Where did this happen? Could have been a highway, but where was it? It was ambiguous. It should have been a highway. I'll get to that in a second. That's a good point. What did you say?
On the way to Jerusalem.
Basically on the way to Jerusalem, but where on the way? There's a lot of on the way. Right on the near his homeland in Samaria. That's an important fact. Who were the people being healed? Lepers, yeah, okay. Men also. Another detail there. That's enough details. So let's take those things that you just pointed out, and let's boil down to the ones that Luke thinks is most important and why he's emphasizing in this place in the story. First thing, it's totally important that the story happens as Jesus leaves his homeland and enters Samaria. If you've been through sermons that talk about Samaria, a preacher can't mention the word without saying something about the conflict between Jews and Samaritans. It was a cultural thing. A trip to Jerusalem from Galilee just had to take the road, the highway, through Samaria. There was no other way unless you went way into the desert. That's not really even a road. So you had to go through there. And most every person who took that trip, most every Jew who went in there, would have held at best some indifference. More generally, a disgust at this dirty, immoral, defectively religious country. They were kind of neighbors. They had shared a faith in the past, and they had split, and there was not much getting along. You've heard this from Jesus. He's passed through here. We've heard the Good Samaritan story, which only makes sense if there's already some conflict between the people who are hearing Jesus and the Samaritans. But Luke wants us to know that this is in Samaria, and Jesus shows up, and how does Jesus acknowledge that this is Samaria and these people are Samaritans? How does he acknowledge it? Nothing. He doesn't care. Luke wants us to know that Jesus doesn't care. He doesn't even ask the guys, hey, what do you really believe about the Scriptures before he heals them? He doesn't ask that. He doesn't say, what do you think about the history of our faiths coming together, Judaism and the Samaritan ancient religion? He doesn't come to that. He doesn't even ask them about Obamacare. He just comes in and he heals them. It's as though Jesus didn't really care that they were Samaritan. His response is so different than the things that we notice about people. These guys need help, so he helps them. They're outcasts, so what? It must be hard to cultivate such a lack of awareness in the world. Second thing that's most important to Luke, leprosy. Leprosy, you can't miss leprosy if you were to see it. The word in the ancient context really carries a lot of different diseases or afflictions, but the main one that it's usually talking about is a really gross and really contagious disease. Does anyone here know the medical name today for leprosy? Not like the fancy, it's called Hansen's disease. So, I'm famous for people's noses falling off. It's a really gross, really contagious disease. And in those days, because of that, towns would take all of the people who contracted this disease and they would send them away. Away from everyone, away from their home, banished. Away from their jobs, couldn't work, couldn't farm, couldn't go to church, couldn't play music with other people. They were totally isolated. There were no hospitals. There were no candy stripers. There were no visitations. No one baked them a casserole. They were completely alone except for the other people who were sick and dying with the same thing that they had. Lepers knew there were rules about this, very strict rules. Lepers were not allowed anywhere near regular people like you. And we would never go anywhere near a leper, which brings up Tamara's point of what the heck they were doing on a highway. Because Jesus was on a highway. Or so we assume. That's the quickest way there. It's possible. There's no way to defend this, but it's totally possible that Jesus went out of his way to find these lepers. Totally possible. But whatever that is, wherever Jesus was, I find it interesting that on one hand, Jesus cultivates a complete lack of awareness for the things that really don't matter. And on the other hand, he is so attuned to companionship, so conscientious to people who need his help. On one hand, he's so unaware, and on the other hand, he is so carefully attuned to needs around him. And there are difficult situations around us, and most of us, frankly, tend to be pretty oblivious. It's just our natural state of affairs. Think yourself, just you yourself, how much you hold on to, how much stuff you have on your chest. If you found someone who was really good at listening, and you could just share everything on your chest, how much would come out? Now look at all the people in this room. They have all that stuff too, and we don't know it. We tend to be, this isn't blaming us, this is just who we are. We tend to struggle to be aware of the important things. We immediately aware, we can't help but be aware of genders and nationality and dirty clothes, and only occasionally can we really reach that point of paying attention to loneliness or oppression or injustice. November 9th, 1989, I was 12, and for some reason we had that Friday off of school, so Thursday night I went to my friend's house, Scott Vandiver. He had a Nintendo, I didn't, so I went to his house to play Nintendo. This was the old school Nintendo, like 8-bit, you had to blow into it to make it work. Anyone remember these things? This was a cool game. So we played a lot of Nintendo that day on November 9th. In fact, we chose Super Mario 2. Which really is not the best Super Mario game. Super Mario 1 was great. Super Mario 3 was a huge leap forward. 2 was a little weak. But 12-year-old kids, we were all over it. We played so much Nintendo that day. Our thumbs were raw. We were just passing that simple controller back and forth, watching the pixelated mushrooms and the little bricks crack and all these things. I hate video games now. I'd rather run a marathon or do something dumb like that. But it took us many, many hours until we beat that game. And we did. We were like two 12-year-olds who conquered the world, high-fiving and toasting and whatever. We beat Super Mario 2 in a day. And so Scott and I, we turned off the Nintendo, and the TV, as it used to do in those days, it naturally fell onto channel 3 or 4, kind of wherever you put it in there. And it just kind of fell onto that channel, and so the TV came on. Can anyone tell me what was on the TV?
News?
Nope. Well, yeah, it actually was. It was important news that day. Does anyone remember what it was?
What year?
November 9th, 1989.
Berlin Wall.
Berlin Wall. Berlin Wall came on. Was that Dan got that? There you go. Berlin Wall had fallen. This was the most important world event in my life until 9/11. Second most important event in my entire life. And we saw the TV. We saw it happen. We saw the celebration. We saw the distress. We saw it all. We saw the news. And we didn't care. We had a snack. We went right back to playing. We figured if we can beat it once, we can beat it again. I can forgive my 12-year-old self for not being aware and conscientious of world politics. But I kind of shudder to think how little I've changed since then. It scares me that sometimes people will get so worked up about 5 cents off on gasoline. But we don't pay as much attention to the conditions of people who pick our tomatoes so that we can save 5 cents on them. It's so easy for us to pay attention to pretty people and to special people and to young people. And how often is it that we just ignore the real value that people have when they walk by us or roll by us? How many people in this country do you think are more aware of Miley Cyrus than the Syrian militia? A lot. Jesus' first lesson in this story of how to respond to the good news of God's grace is simply this: pay attention to the world around you, to the things that matter. If you are a gregarious extrovert, this is a bad week for you because there's nothing you can do. This isn't a lesson to go do something. If you're a good introvert here and just patient, this is perfect for you. Here's Jesus' big first advice on how to respond to the gospel. Just stop and keep your senses open to what's around you. So, there's another character other than Jesus in this story. We pointed out, Jesus does send these guys to a priest, and he does say, the quote in mine is, as they went, they were cleansed. I don't want to say those are unimportant details, but in this particular telling of the story, those are kind of details, because there are other stories where Jesus heals, and that's the climax. And there are plenty of stories where Jesus gets into kind of a one-upmanship with priests, and that's kind of the climax of that story. In this case, there's echoes of that, but what's far more important, at least in my reading and in some commentaries I've read, the real point here is that one man returns to say what? Thank you. I don't want to bash the other 9. I have no idea what they did. I'd like to think that some of them ran to their families because they hadn't seen their families. And they just some of you, that's the first thing you do, and that would be holy to do that. Maybe they continued on to the priest. We don't know. They went to church. They prayed. It's possible. Maybe they went to a bar and played Super Mario. I don't know. I don't really care about them. But what's important about this story is that one man and his gratitude. He's the only one who is aware of God's grace. He's the only one who pays attention to this blessing in his life and from where it comes. And maybe, I don't know his backstory. Maybe he just had a really good mom who made him write lots of thank you notes. Or maybe he was so caught up in the emotion, he never made it to the priest, and he just ran around in circles, and there's Jesus again. He's like, oh, I'll go say thanks to that guy. Or maybe, this is the backstory I like, and I'm completely writing this into the Bible, but maybe he has practiced a cultivated sense of awareness and gratitude in his life. Maybe he's always looking out for places where he can say thank you to God. Awareness seems so simple because it's so passive, but we often overlook the work it takes, the preparation. Not just to be aware of places you can help in the world, that's great, but to be aware of the beauty around us. What would it take? What would it take for you to manifest awareness into giving thanks for the things you notice? What practices could you start today? What habits would you have in order to be more aware of important things in the world and be more able to respond to them in thanksgiving? And I think this is the beginning. This is kind of the common denominator to holiness, is to just be aware. Buddhists do a really good job of emphasizing this. Christians, I think, should pay attention to this story and hear Jesus saying, just open your senses. And consider how religions, how often they're, the message we get from so many religions is do this and then you'll get this. But here Jesus is holding something very opposite to that. He says, here, have this, and now maybe everyone gets this, but some of you are going to respond in thanks. And that's it. Do this, get this, and Jesus says, get this, and let's respond in thanks. It's a very oversimplified way of summing up the entire Christian faith in one sentence, but that's really an emphasis of Presbyterianism, of starting, what started our style of faith that led to this church right now, is that comparison we just made. If anyone ever asks you, what do Presbyterians believe? Well, there's nothing that we all agree on. But if you want to go back 500 years and look at kind of the one point of what it is that started this movement here. It's the radical idea that God is not in the business of spiritual consumerism. God isn't into the idea of us earning something over here. We don't act in one way or believe in some way or take part in some ritual in order to get blessed or heaven or some material gain in our life. Instead, we start with the fact that we, maybe everyone, have this gift, call it grace, call it blessings, call it salvation, and when we are aware of that, we respond. When we are aware of that, both naturally and spiritually, we respond with thanksgiving, with prayer, with worship, with moral behavior, with awe, with interest at the world. This is how, I'll read you a short little thing from Kimberly Bracken Long. She's a professor of worship at Columbia Theological Seminary down in Atlanta, Presbyterian Seminary. She says, when Christians practice gratitude, they come to worship not just to get something out of it, but to give thanks and praise God. Stewardship is transformed from fundraising to the glad gratitude of joyful givers. The mission of the church changes from ethical duty to the work of grateful hands and hearts. Prayer includes not only our intercessions and supplications, but also our thanksgivings. I think there's something right. I really resonate to that last line. Prayer includes not only our intercessions and supplications, but also our thanksgivings. My best prayers, I'm just going to be open to you. My best prayers are not pleading with God to make things right in your life. And unfortunately, they're not asking God for guidance on how to lead churches and help towns and all these things. I do those things. I put a lot of effort into it. But the points where my prayer is just pure and feels like I'm just talking, like to you, but to God, that point is when I just notice something and I point it out to myself and I say, wow. That's a prayer. Wow. Thanks, please, wow. Anne Lamott just wrote a book about that about a year ago. I might reflect on God's role in creating the things that make me say wow. I might offer some praise. I might mumble something even about thanks for this experience. But the root of my best prayer is the times when I'm aware of beauty or grace and I respond with holy amazement. I'd give anything for someone to teach me how to do that better. I can't teach myself, I can't teach you, but I can point out that this is the nugget of the story that Dennis just read, that Jesus wants us to be aware of the things around and to respond in gratitude and in help and in awe. With a calm awareness of the last falling aspen leaves, or the sound of the wind, or the vision of swirling stars, or the sound of a great trumpet solo, or a rainbow after a storm. May we practice holiness with our simple awareness. Amen.